It was a typical Tuesday morning at Maggie's Diner, nestled on the corner of Maple and 3rd in the heart of a small, quiet town. The sun had just risen, casting a warm golden glow through the large windows that lined the front of the diner. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air as the regulars began to trickle in, exchanging small talk and laughter. For Chris Larson, the 45-year-old owner, it was another ordinary day, a continuation of the routine he had lived for most of his life. He had inherited the diner from his father 5 years ago, and while the weight of responsibility sometimes pressed down on him, there was comfort in the familiarity of the business. Each morning, he arrived early to prep, ensuring the place was spotless and ready for the rush of customers. He knew the names of nearly everyone who walked in, and they knew his. He was part of the fabric of the town, an unassuming figure who kept the diner running smoothly. As Chris moved behind the counter, his eyes briefly flickered over to Sarah, the young waitress working the morning shift. She had been employed at Maggie's for just over a year, and Chris had watched her grow from an unsure, quiet girl into a confident and assertive woman. Sarah was in her mid-20s, with short blonde hair and a quick wit that made her one of the most beloved waitstaff members. She always knew how to make the regulars smile, even on their worst days. Today, as usual, she was wearing her diner uniform, a simple red apron over a white blouse, tied neatly in the back. She greeted each customer with a smile, asking about their morning, their families, and remembering the details they'd shared the week before. Chris admired her ability to make the place feel like home for everyone who entered. The diner was a second home for many of the town's residents, offering a place of solace and connection in a world that often felt disconnected. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the comfort of routine and the sense of belonging. Tom, the town's mechanic, sat in his usual spot at the counter, sipping his coffee and reading the morning paper. Ellen, a retired school teacher, sat by the window, knitting while she waited for her usual eggs and toast. And Jake, the young lawyer who had recently moved back to town, was engaged in a quiet conversation with Maggie, the elderly woman who had been working at the diner since Chris's father ran it. Despite the peaceful scene inside, there was an undercurrent of tension in the town that Chris couldn't quite ignore. Recent town hall meetings had sparked heated debates about national politics, with sharp divides appearing between the conservative old guard and the more progressive newcomers. The chatter around town had become increasingly polarized. At the last town meeting, it was impossible to miss the tension that lingered long after the discussions had ended. Political bumper stickers and MAGA hats had started to show up more frequently in the small crowd, adding to the already growing divide. Chris had never been one to get involved in politics, preferring to keep his opinions to himself and focus on the diner. But lately, the division had seeped into conversations between regular customers, sometimes leading to uncomfortable silences or abrupt changes in subject. It was clear that something had shifted in the town, but Chris wasn't sure how it would affect his business, or his relationships with the people he'd known for years. Chris finished preparing the last of the breakfast orders and set them on the counter. As he leaned back to survey the quiet scene, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that today would be different. He didn't know why or how, but he sensed it in the air. Change was coming. The door chimed as another customer entered, and Chris forced the thought from his mind, focusing instead on the familiar hum of the diner. It was just as he turned to check on the coffee pot that the door opened again with a creak. A man stepped inside, his presence immediately drawing attention. Greg Matthews, a local contractor and outspoken conservative, was wearing a red MAGA hat perched on his head. Chris recognized him instantly. While Greg wasn't a regular at the diner, he had occasionally popped in for coffee or a quick bite during the busy hours. He was well known in town, hardworking, vocal about his conservative beliefs, and a frequent attendee of town meetings. Greg's arrival, particularly with the hat, felt like a subtle disruption in the normally calm flow of things. His politics were no secret, and he wasn't shy about expressing them, often engaging in animated discussions with anyone who would listen. Sarah, who had been standing at the counter chatting with Ellen, noticed Greg almost immediately. Her face tightened, though she managed a smile and greeted him in her usual polite manner. Chris watched from the kitchen, an uneasy tension building as he knew what would likely happen next. The diner was, after all, a small-town business, and people were used to respecting one another's differences, but Sarah had been increasingly vocal about her progressive views. She didn't shy away from standing up for what she believed in, especially when it came to issues of respect and dignity. Chris had overheard her express her frustration with the growing political divide in the town more than once, but he hadn't expected it to spill over into the diner. Greg didn't waste much time before making a comment, something typical of his persona, designed to get under people's skin. "Nice hat, huh?" he said, tipping it slightly, his eyes narrowing as he looked over at Sarah. He was referring to the MAGA slogan, of course, and it was clear he intended to provoke a response. Sarah paused, her smile faltering. She wasn't one to take this lightly. "You can keep your hat, but I won't be serving you today," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. The words hung in the air for a moment before she turned to go retrieve a coffee pot from the back. Greg's expression shifted instantly from surprise to outrage. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice rising slightly as he glanced around the room, expecting to find support. "I'm not serving you," Sarah repeated, her tone unwavering. "I'm not comfortable serving someone who supports a man like that," she added, nodding towards the MAGA hat. The words felt charged, heavy with the weight of everything Sarah had been feeling in the growing political climate. She had finally said what had been on her mind for months now, and the consequences of that decision were already beginning to unfold. Chris, still in the kitchen, stood frozen. His heart skipped a beat as he realized the tension was escalating. He had no idea how Sarah's decision would play out. He felt a deep sense of responsibility, not only as the owner but as someone who had watched Sarah grow from a shy employee into someone who was unafraid to voice her opinion. But he also knew the impact this could have on the diner, on his livelihood, and on the relationships with the very people who helped keep it afloat. The room went silent as the dispute between Sarah and Greg began to unfold, and Chris realized that he had to make a choice, one that would forever change the course of his business and his community. The air in the diner grew thick with tension, like the calm before a storm that everyone could feel but no one could predict. Greg stood there, his face reddening as Sarah turned her back to him and began walking away toward the kitchen. The hum of the diner, once comforting and familiar, now seemed distant, muffled by the weight of the moment. Greg's voice, sharp and escalating, broke through the silence. "What kind of place is this? Are you really going to turn me away just because of a hat?" he asked, his tone dripping with disbelief. Sarah paused for a moment but didn't turn around. She stood still, hands clenched tightly around the coffee pot she was holding. In that brief silence, Chris could hear his own heart beating in his chest as he watched the scene unfold through the small kitchen window. He couldn't believe what was happening. This wasn't the usual kind of dispute he was used to managing, and Sarah, for all her boldness, wasn't prepared for the firestorm she had just ignited. "I'm not turning you away because of a hat," Sarah said, her voice steady but carrying an edge of defiance. "I'm turning you away because of the hate that comes with it. I can't just ignore what it stands for." Chris could see the confusion on Greg's face as he processed her words. He had always been outspoken about his political beliefs, often trying to stir up conversation wherever he went. To him, his MAGA hat wasn't just an accessory, it was a statement, a symbol of his loyalty to the ideals he believed in. But Sarah wasn't backing down. The usual banter that came with the territory of small-town life was now gone, replaced by something more personal, more volatile. Sarah had crossed a line, and she knew it. Greg's anger flared, and he took a step closer to Sarah, his voice rising with each word. "You think you're better than me? Just because I support my country and my president, you're going to treat me like this?" he spat. "You don't even know me." But Sarah, despite the palpable anger in the air, stood her ground. I don't have to know you to know that I don't want to be part of a world that encourages division and hate, she shot back, her voice louder now. And I'm not going to serve someone who chooses to wear that hat like it's some sort of badge of honor. It was a sharp exchange, one that would have sent the average diner guest running for cover. But Chris was frozen in place, his eyes locked on the scene as his mind raced. He had heard rumors and murmurs about Sarah's political views over the past few months, her frustration with the direction the country seemed to be heading, her passionate speeches about social justice, but he hadn't thought it would ever come to this. Sarah had always been a fierce advocate for her beliefs, but she had never before brought that fire into the diner so openly. Greg, for his part, wasn't backing down either. He took another step forward, his hands curling into fists, though not raised yet. You're a kid who doesn't know anything about real life. You don't understand what's at stake here, he said, his voice seething with resentment. That was when Chris, who had been watching from the kitchen with mounting anxiety, finally stepped into the fray. His presence was like an anchor in the growing storm, his calm demeanor clashing against the intensity of the confrontation. He walked out from behind the counter, the sound of his boots on the floor echoing through the tense silence that had fallen over the diner. Sarah, Chris said, his voice low but firm, why don't you take a break for a second? I'll take care of this. Sarah turned to look at him, her eyes blazing with frustration, but she said nothing as she quietly placed the coffee pot on the counter and moved toward the back of the diner. The customers around the room, who had all been quietly watching the exchange, turned their attention back to their meals, their conversations now reduced to murmurs as they waited to see what would happen next. Chris walked toward Greg, his heart pounding. He had never been one to enjoy confrontation, especially in a place that had always felt like home, a sanctuary for the people who lived here. But the tension had reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. This wasn't just a political argument or a difference of opinion. It was about the very fabric of the community, about how they treated one another when faced with challenges. Greg, let's calm down, Chris said, his voice steady but serious. This isn't the place for that kind of argument. I know you're upset, but we're all trying to get through the day here. If you want to talk about it, we can go outside, but I'm asking you to leave Sarah out of it. Greg's face twisted in disbelief. You're taking her side? You're going to let her walk all over me, and you're going to stand there and say nothing? Chris nodded slowly, choosing his words carefully. I'm not taking sides, Greg. But this is my diner, and Sarah is part of this place. If you want to keep arguing, that's fine, but not here. Not in front of these people. Greg's jaw clenched. The anger in his eyes burned, but there was a flicker of realization behind it. Chris wasn't backing down. He wasn't just a passive bystander. In that moment, Greg understood that this wasn't just about him or Sarah. It was about the diner and everything it stood for, the community that had grown around it, the shared understanding that no matter where you came from or what you believed, this place was where you could come together. I'm not going to sit here and be disrespected, Greg muttered, turning on his heel. You'll regret this, Larson. Mark my words. Chris watched as Greg stormed out of the diner, his footsteps heavy as the door slammed shut behind him. The tension in the room lingered for a few moments before the normal hum of conversation began to slowly resume. But it was different now. People spoke in quieter tones, glancing nervously at one another, as if waiting for the fallout of the confrontation to begin. As Sarah moved to clean a table, Chris caught the eye of one of the regulars sitting at the counter. It was Tom, the mechanic, a man in his early 60s who had spent most of his life working with his hands and who was about as no-nonsense as they come. He didn't engage in political conversations often, but everyone knew where he stood. Tom was a quiet man, but there was no mistaking his conservative leanings. He had been a friend of Chris's father, and he was one of the people who had kept the diner running through the years, always offering a helping hand when needed. Hey, Tom, Chris said, walking over to his regular spot. You okay? Tom looked up from his half-finished coffee and gave a slow nod. Yeah, I'm fine, he said, his voice low but steady. He paused for a moment, then added, but I gotta tell you, that was something, wasn't it? Chris leaned against the counter, feeling the weight of the conversation about to shift in a way he wasn't sure he was ready for. It was. Sarah didn't hold back. No, she didn't, Tom agreed, taking a sip of his coffee. I get it. I get what she was trying to say. But this town's been divided long before this little spat. You know that, right? Chris nodded slowly. He had seen the changes, heard the whispers at town meetings, and noticed the shift in the way people talked to each other. It wasn't the same town it had been when his father ran the diner. The debates had become sharper, the rhetoric more extreme. People who used to agree on basic things, who used to be able to laugh together over a cup of coffee, were now avoiding eye contact, exchanging tense glances instead of greetings. Yeah, I know, Chris said quietly, his fingers brushing the edge of the counter. But it just feels different now. It feels like we've crossed some line. Tom took another sip of his coffee, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked around the room. Well, you gotta understand. That hat, MAGA, it's a symbol for a lot of people, Chris. It's not just some political slogan anymore. It represents more than that. For some, it's about values, about fighting for what they believe is right. And for others? It's a symbol of everything that's wrong with this country right now. Chris exhaled slowly, his mind spinning as he tried to absorb Tom's words. He had never seen things so clearly before, and Tom's blunt honesty was unsettling in its clarity. He had lived his life keeping the peace, keeping the business running, staying out of the crossfire. But now, that peace was crumbling in front of him. And it was coming from all sides. He wasn't sure if he was ready to choose a side. I don't know, Tom. It's all too much. We've got a business to run here. People depend on this place. I'm not sure how I can fix this. Tom placed his coffee cup down gently, leaning in a little closer. You don't need to fix anything, Chris. Not yet. But if you're gonna keep this place running, you gotta face the music. It's gonna get messy. Sarah, she's gonna have some explaining to do. And so are you. Chris felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had a feeling Tom was right. The divide in town wasn't just a political debate anymore, it was personal. People were going to start picking sides. He had already seen the beginning of it. And as much as he wanted to believe everything would blow over, part of him knew that wasn't going to happen. The rest of the day passed in a blur. By the time the lunch rush came around, the atmosphere had shifted again, but this time it wasn't just uncomfortable, it was hostile. Jake, the young lawyer who had recently moved back to town, came in around noon. He wasn't a regular, but he had quickly become a fixture, his briefcase often resting next to him on the counter as he worked through his lunch. Jake wasn't as overtly political as Greg, but it didn't take long to figure out where his allegiances lay. He had always been friendly with Sarah, but today, he seemed to carry an unspoken tension in the air as he walked into the diner. Hey, Jake, Chris greeted him, trying to muster a smile. What can I get for you today? Jake paused for a moment, looking around at the still silent diner before sitting down. I'll just have the usual, Chris, he said, his voice tight. And maybe a cup of coffee. Chris nodded and turned to get his order, but as he did, he could feel Jake's eyes on him. There was something in the lawyer's gaze that told Chris this wasn't just another quiet lunch. Jake didn't speak at first, but the tension in his silence was palpable. Finally, Jake spoke up, his voice almost casual but with a hint of something deeper. You know, I've been hearing things. About Sarah and that guy this morning. People are talking. Chris sighed and set the coffee pot down. Yeah. I figured they would. You don't think she went too far? Jake's voice was quiet, but Chris could hear the judgment in it. The following days felt like the calm before the storm. The town of Maplewood, usually so quiet and predictable, now felt like it was holding its breath, unsure of what would come next. The fallout from the confrontation at Maggie's diner had rippled through the community with surprising speed. The diner, a place that had once felt like a safe, neutral haven for everyone in town, was now at the center of a political firestorm. People were talking. Word spread fast in small towns, and rumors had a way of taking on lives of their own. Sarah hadn't been back to work since the incident, and Chris wasn't sure if it was because she was still processing everything or if she had just been trying to avoid the inevitable confrontation with the regulars. The quiet judgment that followed the altercation had been palpable, and Chris couldn't blame her for wanting to stay away. The silence from the community spoke volumes, and he knew it was only a matter of time before something had to give. That morning, when Chris opened the diner for the first time since the incident, he could feel the weight of the eyes on him. John, the local carpenter, was the first to walk in. He was a man of few words, preferring the company of tools and timber to idle chatter, but everyone knew his opinion when it came to anything related to politics. John was a proud, outspoken conservative, and it didn't take much to guess where he stood on the recent controversy. "Morning, Chris," John said gruffly, tipping his worn baseball cap in greeting as he slid into his usual seat at the counter. His voice had an edge to it, the kind of tone that made it clear he wasn't just here for a coffee, he had something to say. "Morning, John," Chris replied, trying to keep his voice neutral as he slid the coffee pot toward him. "How's the work going?" John took a long sip before speaking, his eyes not meeting Chris's. "Work's fine. But I gotta tell you, I'm not sure about this whole thing with Sarah." Chris tensed at the mention of Sarah's name. He had been waiting for this moment, knowing that sooner or later the regulars would confront him about what had happened. "What do you mean?" John took a long sip before speaking, his eyes not meeting Chris's. "Work's fine. But I gotta tell you, I'm not sure about this whole thing with Sarah." Chris tensed at the mention of Sarah's name. He had been waiting for this moment, knowing that sooner or later the regulars would confront him about what had happened. "What do you mean?" John set his coffee cup down and finally looked up, his gaze sharp. "She's causing trouble, Chris. You've seen it, right? You know she's been going on about that hat and all this nonsense about what it represents. And now, look at this. You've got people talking about it all over town. People who used to come here every day are starting to stay away. Don't know if you've noticed, but business is down." Chris fought the urge to look away. He knew John was right, business was down. There were fewer faces at the counter, fewer regulars popping in for their usual meals. The atmosphere had changed. The hum of laughter and chatter that had once filled the diner now felt strained, stilted, like the air had been sucked out of the room. "I'm not saying she was right to turn that guy away, John, but you know Sarah. She's passionate. She feels like she has to take a stand." John's expression tightened. "A stand? More like a tantrum. I've got no problem with people standing up for what they believe in, but you can't just go around pushing people away because they don't see things the way you do. That's not how we do things here." The conversation hung heavy between them. Chris didn't want to get into a full-blown argument with John, but he couldn't help but feel the frustration rising in his chest. This wasn't just about a disagreement anymore. It wasn't just about Sarah and the man in the MAGA hat. It was about the heart of the town, the community that had held together for so long despite its differences. "I don't know what you want me to do, John," Chris said, his voice quieter now. "I can't control what Sarah does, and I don't know how to fix this. But what happened, it's bigger than a disagreement. People are on edge right now. This town's been divided for a long time, and I don't think anyone's willing to come together anymore." John grunted and leaned back in his chair. "Maybe you're right. But that doesn't mean we should be letting it tear apart everything that matters. People used to come here for more than just food, they came here to feel like they were part of something. Now, I don't know what we've got left." Before Chris could respond, the door to the diner opened, and in walked Rachel, the high school teacher. She had always been the type to keep her head down and her opinions to herself, especially when it came to politics. Rachel had worked at the diner as a teenager and had always been one of the more reserved customers. But today, she wasn't holding back. There was something different in her step, something urgent in the way she moved. She slid into the booth next to John, her eyes already on Chris. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, though her tone made it clear she wasn't here for pleasantries. Chris raised an eyebrow, feeling the tension rise another notch. "Not at all, Rachel. What's on your mind?" "I've heard a lot of talk around town," Rachel said, her voice tight, "and I think it's time we talked about what happened. People aren't just angry, they're confused. I know you've got a lot going on with this diner, but you can't just let things fester. You've got to step in." Chris sighed, rubbing his temples as he leaned against the counter. It felt like every conversation in town was turning into a confrontation. "Rachel, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. This isn't just about one argument. This is bigger than Sarah. It's bigger than me." Rachel shook her head, her eyes narrowing with a mix of frustration and determination. "It is bigger, yes. But that doesn't mean you can just ignore it. You're the one who's been here the longest, Chris. You're the one who's seen what this town was and what it's becoming. You can't just sit back and let it unravel. You need to decide what kind of place you want this to be." The words hit Chris like a wave crashing into the shore. He had been trying to avoid facing the reality of what was happening. He had tried to stay neutral, to stay out of the fray. But the more he listened to the voices around him, the more he realized how deep the divisions went. There was no easy way out of this, no quick fix. Whatever happened next would shape the future of not just Maggie's diner, but the community itself. As the day wore on, the diner's usual rhythm seemed impossible to return to. People came in, but conversations were more subdued, the chatter almost forced. Greg, the man in the MAGA hat, had yet to return. There were whispers about him, too, though no one seemed brave enough to confront him directly. A few of the regulars who leaned more conservative had offered their support for his actions, while others had remained silent, unsure of what side to take. As Chris watched the ebb and flow of the day, he knew that something had to change. There was no going back to the way things had been. The world outside the diner was moving too fast, pulling people in different directions. He felt the weight of his role in the community more than ever before. He had been avoiding it, pretending things would calm down on their own. But the longer he waited, the harder it became to ignore the truth. This moment, this incident, was not just a random spat. It was the beginning of something bigger. And whether he liked it or not, he was going to have to decide what side he was on, before it was too late. The question wasn't just about Sarah or Greg. It wasn't even about the diner anymore. It was about the people of Maplewood. What kind of community were they going to be? And who was going to lead them through this mess? As the last of the lunch crowd trickled out, Chris took a deep breath. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure: the town was changing, and he needed to decide where he stood, before the change passed him by. The days that followed were a blur of tension and uncertainty. The quiet hum of the diner, once a symbol of comfort and familiarity, now felt like an echo of its former self. Chris could feel the eyes of the community on him every time he walked through the door, as though the weight of their expectations and judgments had become an invisible force, pushing him in directions he hadn't anticipated. People were divided, and the space that was once a sanctuary of neutrality now seemed like a battleground for every opinion and belief in town. Sarah had been absent from the diner since that fateful day, and Chris couldn't blame her. He knew she was struggling, caught between her beliefs and the reality of what had transpired. He missed her presence at the counter, her sharp wit and the way she always seemed to know how to defuse the tension when the regulars started to bicker. Without her, the diner felt incomplete. And yet, every time Chris tried to reach out to her, he was met with silence. She wasn't ready to face the consequences of her actions, and who could blame her? What happened that day had touched a nerve that ran deeper than any of them could have predicted. One morning, Chris arrived early to get the diner ready for the breakfast crowd. The coffee pot was brewing, the griddle sizzling with bacon and eggs, and the sound of utensils clinking against plates filled the air. It was the usual start to a busy day, but there was a heaviness hanging over everything. As Chris wiped down the counter, he noticed the door to the diner opening slowly, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw Sarah standing in the doorway. She was wearing her usual uniform, but there was a difference in her demeanor. She wasn't the confident, outspoken waitress he knew. Today, she was hesitant, almost unsure of herself as she stepped inside. "Sarah?" Chris called out, his voice a mix of surprise and relief. Sarah paused, taking in the familiar sights and sounds of the diner. Her eyes seemed distant, as though she was trying to process everything that had happened in the days since the confrontation. "Hey, Chris," she said softly, her voice strained. I think it's time I came back." Chris smiled, though it was tinged with concern. "We've missed you around here. You okay?" She shrugged, the weight of her decision settling in her posture. "I don't know if I'm okay. But I've been thinking about it a lot. About what happened, about everything that's changed, and I realized that I can't just walk away. This place means something to me, and I can't let it fall apart because of one stupid mistake." Chris nodded, relieved that she was back, but also sensing the conflict that still lingered beneath the surface. He knew that things had changed. That Sarah's return wouldn't magically undo the rift that had formed in the community. The diner would never be the same again, and neither would they. But despite the uncertainty, there was still a glimmer of hope. Sarah had come back, not just to serve food, but to confront the very thing that had torn them apart, their differences. For the next few hours, the diner was busier than usual. The familiar faces came in, Tom the mechanic, Rachel the teacher, John the carpenter. Each one of them glanced at Sarah when she returned to her post, but no one said anything at first. The silence that had hung over the place since that day seemed to have thickened, like a fog that no one could shake off. They all wanted to know what would happen next. Would Sarah apologize? Would Greg return and demand some sort of reckoning? Or would this be the moment when everything fell apart completely? As the day wore on, Chris could feel the tension building. No one wanted to be the first to speak, but the question was on everyone's mind: what happens now? It wasn't until mid-afternoon that Chris got his answer, though he wasn't sure he was prepared for it. The door swung open, and in walked Greg, the man in the MAGA hat. He was alone, and as soon as he entered, the room seemed to freeze. People stopped mid-conversation, forks paused halfway to their mouths. Greg didn't look at anyone. He just walked to the counter and sat down at the stool where he had been before, his hat still perched proudly atop his head. Sarah, standing behind the counter, didn't flinch. She didn't even acknowledge his presence right away. But Chris could feel the moment when her breath caught in her chest, the way her hands trembled slightly as she set down the dish she was holding. She had been expecting this. Deep down, she knew this moment would come. But what surprised Chris the most was the calm that settled over her as she took a deep breath and walked toward him. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice steady, though her eyes betrayed the emotions swirling within her. Greg didn't look at her, didn't even seem to register the weight of her words. His eyes were fixed on the menu, though it was clear he wasn't really reading it. He was waiting. For something. Perhaps an apology. Perhaps an explanation. Whatever it was, he wasn't going to get it from Sarah right away. "You've got a lot of nerve coming back here after what you said," she said, her voice now a little sharper, her anger starting to rise. Greg finally looked up, and for the first time, Sarah saw something she hadn't expected: vulnerability. There was a flicker in his eyes, something that told her he wasn't here to pick another fight, but rather to confront the reality of what had happened. His jaw tightened as he spoke, and for a moment, Sarah could see the weight of the past few days pressing down on him. "I came back because I didn't want this to end like this," Greg said, his voice low. "I came here because you stood up for what you believe in. And I respect that, even if I don't agree with it." The room seemed to hold its breath. Chris watched from the counter, trying to make sense of the situation as it unfolded. For the first time since this whole debacle began, it felt like both Sarah and Greg were seeing each other as human beings, people who had opinions, yes, but also people who had lived lives and endured struggles that no one could fully understand. Sarah paused for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I wasn't trying to make a statement. I was just trying to do what felt right at the time. But I see now that this isn't about just one disagreement. It's about everything that's wrong with how we talk to each other now. Everyone's so quick to judge, to pick sides, to point fingers. It's exhausting." Greg nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I get it. I've felt the same way. I've been fighting my battles, but I never stopped to think about what it means for the people around me. I've been so focused on what I believe is right that I didn't see how it was hurting others." For the first time, there was a quiet moment between them, a shared understanding. It wasn't an apology, but it was something else. Something that felt like a small opening. Neither of them knew what to do with that space yet, but it was there. The walls had started to come down, at least just a little. But the tension in the room was still thick. The rest of the diners had resumed their meals, but the conversations had shifted. People were no longer avoiding the issue. They were confronting it head-on, and for the first time, they weren't speaking to each other through the lens of their political views. They were speaking to each other as people. People with different experiences, different beliefs, and yet the same needs, to be heard, understood, and respected. Chris could feel it then, the change in the air. The weight of the decision he had been avoiding for so long had finally landed squarely on his shoulders. He wasn't just managing a diner anymore. He was managing a community. And the responsibility that came with that was bigger than he had ever realized. As the last customer left the diner that night, Sarah and Greg were still sitting at the counter, talking softly, their voices no longer filled with hostility. There was no sudden resolution. There were no grand gestures. But for the first time since the conflict began, there was a flicker of hope that things could change. As Chris turned off the lights and locked the door, he looked at the two of them. They hadn't solved anything yet. But maybe, just maybe, they had started something. Something that could bring people back together, even if it took time. The question that had lingered in his mind for days now seemed a little less urgent: what happens now? Chris didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he felt like they were heading in the right direction. And that, he realized, was enough for now. As the weeks passed, the quiet recovery of the diner felt both fragile and promising. The tension that had gripped Maplewood had not completely dissipated, but there was a new sense of balance in the air. People still talked about the incident, but the conversations had shifted from accusations and blame to something more reflective. Some had even started to see the diner as a space where they could finally come together, not as opponents, but as people struggling to understand each other. The streets outside still carried whispers of discord, but inside Maggie's diner, something had begun to heal. Chris watched this transformation with a mix of pride and exhaustion. He knew that the journey wasn't over, and that the diner, once the heart of the town, had become an unexpected battleground for something bigger than any of them. The change didn't come overnight, and there were still moments where the old divisions resurfaced. Someone would make a comment, a passing remark that would stir old resentments. But now, when that happened, people didn't simply erupt into conflict. There were pauses, thoughtful silences, and glances exchanged that said, "We've been here before." It was as if the town was learning how to talk again, how to debate without falling into the same traps. Sarah had returned to work regularly, but her presence was different. She wasn't the defiant, outspoken waitress who had initially sparked the storm. She was quieter now, more reflective, but still fiercely committed to her beliefs. She and Greg had continued their conversations in the weeks that followed, and though they never fully reconciled, they had found common ground in unexpected ways. They both realized that the world wasn't as simple as they had once thought, that there were layers to every person, every argument, and every action. Neither had fully changed their minds, but they had gained a new respect for the other's perspective. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the diner's windows, Chris sat in the back booth, lost in thought. He had always been a man who preferred the quiet, the routine of his work. But everything had changed so rapidly. This town, the people, the diner, none of them were the same. And as much as he hated to admit it, the events of the past few weeks had forced him to confront his own beliefs about leadership, community, and responsibility. It wasn't just about serving food anymore. It was about something deeper. Something that connected them all. The sound of the diner door jingled, snapping Chris from his reverie. He looked up to see Rachel, the high school teacher, walking in. She had become one of the most consistent patrons after the incident, always sitting at the same corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee as she graded papers or read the news. Her quiet presence had been a comfort in the midst of all the chaos. Tonight, however, she wasn't carrying her usual stack of papers. Her face was serious, but there was a spark in her eyes that Chris hadn't seen before. "Evening, Chris," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "Mind if I join you?" Chris nodded, motioning to the coffee pot. "Of course, Rachel. What's on your mind?" Rachel leaned forward, her hands clasped in front of her. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and I think it's time to finally address it. Not just for us, but for everyone in town." Chris raised an eyebrow. "Address what?" "The divide," Rachel said, her voice steady. "We can't keep pretending that what happened doesn't matter. People are still holding on to grudges, and it's creating more distance between us. I've been talking to a lot of folks, and I think it's time we did something about it. Not just talk, but actually do something." Chris sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I've been thinking the same thing. But what do we do? It's not like we can just sweep everything under the rug and pretend everything's fine." Rachel nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Exactly. We can't pretend it didn't happen. But what we can do is bring people together. Not in the way we used to, just by serving food and drinks. But by creating a space where people can actually talk, listen to each other, and find some common ground." Chris sat up straighter, intrigued. "You mean like a town meeting or something?" Rachel smiled. "Not a meeting, exactly. But more like a series of discussions. I've spoken to some of the local leaders, and they're on board. We've got to start small, but I think we can begin right here, at the diner. It's the place where everything started. Why not let it be the place where we start to heal?" The idea caught Chris off guard, but as Rachel explained further, he began to see the potential. They would hold informal discussions at Maggie's Diner, a space where people from all sides could come together, have a meal, and share their thoughts. The goal wasn't to agree on everything, but to hear each other's stories, to humanize the issues, and to find some path forward, however small. It wouldn't be easy. There were still people who were bitter, people who weren't ready to let go of the anger that had built up over the past years. But Rachel's idea felt like a step in the right direction. "I'm in," Chris said after a long pause. "I don't know how it's going to go, but if there's a chance to help people listen to each other again, then I'm willing to give it a shot." Rachel's face softened, a look of gratitude crossing her features. "Good. We'll start next week. I'll help spread the word, and we'll see who shows up. The first one will be small, just a few people. But if it works, we can build from there." That night, after closing time, Chris couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. The diner had always been a place of connection, where people could come and find comfort in food, laughter, and conversation. Now, it had a new purpose: to be a place where hard conversations could happen, where people could come to terms with their differences without tearing each other apart. The following week, the first healing conversation, as Rachel called it, took place in the back of the diner. At first, there was palpable awkwardness as people filed in, unsure of what to expect. The usual suspects were there: John the carpenter, Tom the mechanic, Rachel the teacher. But there were also new faces, people who hadn't set foot in the diner in years, some who had been staying away since the incident. They gathered around the long table, unsure of where to begin. Chris could see the wariness in their eyes. Would they argue? Would they scream? Or would they actually listen? The first few minutes were strained, but Rachel stepped in, asking simple questions about how everyone had been feeling over the past few weeks. It wasn't about politics, not at first. It was about the personal toll the conflict had taken on each person. Slowly, the walls started to come down. John, the staunch conservative, began to share stories about his own struggles, about his family, his work, and his fears for the future. It wasn't easy for him, but something in the room had shifted. People were listening. No one interrupted. When Tom spoke up next, talking about his experiences growing up in Maplewood, there was a softening in the room. By the end of the night, there were no grand resolutions, no sudden epiphanies. But there was something. Something small, but significant, a shared understanding that they were all in this together, despite their differences. The days after that first meeting felt different. People were still divided, but the conversation had opened a door. A door that no one could close again. There would be more sessions, more conversations, and though not everyone would be convinced or won over, there was progress. Chris couldn't help but feel proud of what they had started. The diner had become something more than just a place to grab a meal. It had become a space for people to reconnect with each other, to bridge the gaps that had seemed so insurmountable just weeks before. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a cure-all for the division that had taken root in Maplewood. But it was a beginning. A beginning of something that could, in time, bring the town back together. And that, Chris realized, was all they could ask for. The road ahead was still long, and there were many bumps along the way, but now, at least, there was hope. The hope that change was possible, that people could still listen, and that, maybe, there was still a chance to heal. And as Chris locked up the diner late that evening, he stood for a moment by the door, looking out at the quiet street. The stars above glowed faintly in the night sky, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace.